Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion, Powering NDC 3.0, India's next generation public finance reforms for the energy transition. My name is Soumya Jain, and I'm a policy analyst at ISD, and I'll be a host for this webinar. This webinar is being organized by the International Institute for Sustainable Development, a research based not for profit that works towards a world where people and planet thrive. As a part of this webinar, we are releasing our new report that examines India's energy policies and the role of public financial flows in the clean energy transition. In terms of the flow, today's webinar will start with context setting by Mr. Chris Beaton, Director of Public Financial Flows at ISD Energy. Then it'll be followed by a keynote address by Dr. Harshvardhan Singh. This will be followed by a short 10-minute presentation on ISD's new report by my colleague Swasti Raizada, and end with a panel discussion moderated by my colleague Shruti Sharma, ISD's lead for affordable energy and India. If you have any questions during the webinar, I encourage you to use the Q&A function. And for any journalists and media representatives in the room, please submit your questions in the Q&A, and we will come back to them at the end of the panel discussion. To all the participants, please note that this webinar is being recorded and will also be available at ISD's YouTube channel. So it will be recorded and it will be also shared with the registrants after the event. With that, I'm extremely pleased to invite Chris to set the context for today's session.
Thank you so much, Soumya. So good afternoon, everybody. We're nearing the end of 2025. It's been quite a long year in many ways. And we see India's energy policy is at an inflection point, shaped by the pressures of both development and decarbonisation. We see clean energy is on the rise. So India has surpassed 50% non-fossil electricity capacity already in 2025, ahead of its NDC target. For the progress that we've seen so far, we believe that public financial flows have played a key role, and we expect this to continue into the future. And by this term, public financial flows, what I'm talking about is the public money that is linked to the energy sector. So this can be the support measures for energy production and consumption, as well as the revenue that is raised from energy. So when it comes to support, things like subsidies, investments by public sector undertakings, PSUs, and for anyone who's joining internationally today, that's known more often as state-owned enterprises in other countries outside India. Also lending from public financial institutions, PFIs. These three things have all played a decisive role in the fivefold increase in renewables since 2015. And when it comes to revenues, we see that most energy-related revenue is still coming from fossil fuels, despite the significant social and health costs associated with fossil fuel extraction and combustion. So, as India prepares its 2035 NDC and moves towards energy independence and self-reliance, ambition remains high, but a key ingredient for success will be strong alignment across public support measures and a plan for revenue transition. For almost a decade now, ISD has tried to support policymakers and policy researchers in India by just mapping out the state of public financial flows to increase transparency and strengthen evidence-based decision-making. So, with those words, I'm delighted to be setting the scene for the release of our latest edition of this mapping, and today's discussion is going to focus on how central and state budgets, PSUs and PFIs can better align public financial flows with clean energy goals, the reforms that are needed, and how the social benefits of transition can be maximised. So, back to you, Soumya.
Thank you so much, Chris, for setting the context so clearly and grounding today's discussion. With that, I would like to introduce Dr. Harshvardhan Singh, who brings over 3 decades of experience in international trade and policy, development, regulation, and global governance. He has served as the Deputy Director General of the WTO for 8 years until 2013, with responsibilities spanning agriculture, services, trade, environment, and e-commerce. In India, he was also the economic advisor and later secretary at Telecom Regulatory Authority of India. He has taught at multiple universities, including Columbia, Tufts, Nankai, and has been also serving as the member of multiple high-level policy committees. With that, I would like to invite Sir to please deliver the keynote address.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Samya, and I want to thank the ISD for this opportunity. And it's a great privilege to be with the people who are on the panel today. I can see Mr. Singh and some of the others who actually have huge depth of knowledge in this subject matter. So with thanks and for this privilege, I first want to note that I read through the embargoed version of the report that is being launched today. And I want to congratulate ISD's India team for producing this useful report with information, a conceptual framework, and a forward-looking policy-oriented discussion. The conceptual framework and content of the report addresses several policy-related issues that help us, or potentially can help us, improve effective policymaking and implementation. First, the significance of clarity on objectives and transmission of the impact through the policy instrument. All policy initiatives must begin with a great deal of clarity on what is to be achieved and what are the different methods as well as means of transmission of policy impact to achieve them. And then we need to clarify the significance of expenses. And since the report is on subsidies, I'm using the term expenses through different instruments used to help to achieve these objectives. Identify the possibility of improving the effectiveness of the subsidy and the adjustment required to improve the possibility of achieving the relevant objectives. So not only is the data important, but an assessment of that data in a manner that it shows us the implications of the policies that have been used in terms of effectiveness. And India has actually, as was noted before me, that India has actually achieved second time ahead of its objective in terms of non-renewable energy resources. So there is a learning process which would be involved when looking at that. And also to see how the policy impact could be improved further. Then I was struck also in the report by the sequence over the short to medium term to manage the effective operation of and changes in the subsidies used. So with this short background, I just want to get into the main thoughts. A key point to bear in mind is that what governments choose to support in energy today shapes markets, trade patterns, development, and climate outcomes tomorrow and day after. In certain cases, the need for action is much earlier in time. I'm speaking from Delhi, and the pollution levels which Delhi is experiencing is evidence of the implications of climate change, not in the future, but today. So the need for appropriate policies knocking at the door, and in some cases, it's a long line of tasks which need to be addressed. So a clearer understanding of policy choices through key instruments helps improve both the choice of policies and more efficient achievement of key objectives. So the problems are there. The objectives are more or less clear, but there is a lot of interconnectedness and different tools which are available. Data shows that worldwide governments intervene heavily in energy markets to shape energy systems. And energy is a major contributor to the impact on climate. Public financial flows to energy are large, persistent, and policy defining in most major economies, if not all. Public financial flows to energy are shaping growth trajectories trade patterns, and investment decisions. From a multilateral perspective, the discussion on public financial flows is in the report is firmly anchored in the Paris Agreement. Article 2.1c commits parties to making, and I quote, finance flows consistent with the pathways towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. I emphasize pathways towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. Most recently, this article has re-emerged strongly in climate negotiations as countries recognize that aligning public finance is as important as setting the emission targets. So the objective and the tools, one has to really think of it together as a cohesive framework of action. In this background, an important problem is the absence of a clear, shared view of financial support, where it goes, and what the policy objectives are that it serves. Another problem is the absence of detailed information. And in that context, this report plays a very important role. Despite global commitments to align government support for energy, and energy is a term which is used coterminously with public financial flows in IISD's work, they remain poorly tracked and unevenly governed. So this is the significance of monitoring. One of the most important gaps in policies, for policies, is the implementation, monitoring, and ensuring that appropriate implementation is taking place. So this report has emphasized that too. Support for fossil fuels often takes indirect and off-budget forms: tax expenditures, price controls, guarantees, and capital injections, making it difficult for policymakers, trading partners, and institutions to see the full picture. So clarity of what is actually happening. That is an important objective to understand policy and impact. And this report not only emphasizes it, it provides, it goes some way to provide that clarity. Policymakers are thus often only able to see parts of the picture that they directly control or manage, creating the so-called iceberg problem. The iceberg problem says that you actually don't see the whole. Every iceberg, you see only 1/7 of that iceberg outside the water. 6/7 is under the water. So if as large as the iceberg is not known to the policymakers, then there is a major gap to cover. State-owned enterprises play a particularly important role in this complexity. Globally, SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, account for a significant share of energy investment and act simultaneously as commercial entities and instruments of public policy. So that's 3 in 1. Long ago, Timbergun, who won the first Nobel Economics Prize, showed depending on the number of objectives, you need that many instruments to be efficient. So perhaps that kind of concept could also be considered in terms of achievement of these objectives through the instruments. And financial support is a major instrument and incentive in the entire framework. Their decisions, that's the SOE's decisions, reinforce market signals or prolong carbon-intensive pathways, even in the absence of explicit subsidies. This opacity has real global consequences. IISD has estimated that in 2023, global public financial support to fossil fuels exceeded US $1.5 trillion, driven largely by price controls, tax exemptions, and SOE-related support. These levels far exceed public finance directed towards clean energy in many regions, highlighting the scale of misalignment between stated climate goals and actual financial flows. From a trade perspective, too, this creates risk. When public support becomes less visible and less disciplined, it increases uncertainty, fuels perceptions of unfair competition, and complicates cooperation. In a world marked by geopolitical tension and industrial policy resurgence, the absence of transparency raises the likelihood of friction rather than dialogue. Without systematic tracking, it becomes harder to reform, and the discussion risks becoming polarized and incomplete. So, the information base, a good information base on a major instrument such as financial incentives, is very important for clarity of perspective, judging the substantive impact, and assessing the future direction of policy change to improve things. Looking at India, a major economy, an economy which is on the verge of becoming the fourth largest economy, and by before the end of this decade is expected to become the third largest economy. For such an economy, it is important for public financial flows, balancing energy security, fiscal discipline, development priorities, and transition objectives. The government is clear about these various objectives in a larger sense. The information and the discussion and conceptual framework should help policymakers to assess the validity of what they can see is happening on the ground, taking into account the multiple factors which the report has talked about. In this context, it is important to keep in mind that electricity subsidies, SOE investments, and fuel pricing all interact with state finances, industrial competitiveness, and household welfare. And in this background, this report contributes to a critical public good, which is transparency of the information related to policy initiatives. This, in turn, impacts three important objectives. It brings disparate flows for energy into a single analytical framework. It distinguishes between types of support and their likely policy intent. And it enables discussion based on evidence. IISD's definition of public financial flows through subsidies, state-owned enterprises, and public financial institutions serves as an important tool to help articulate and track global progress on the goals under Article 2.1c, which I had just mentioned. It quantifies subsidies based on established global agreements, such as the WTO's agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures, which talks about contribution by the government in terms of financial benefit. Studying and measuring public financial flows for energy helps appreciate the progress made by the nation, contextualizes areas for future policy reform as governments commit and plan the next round of national determined contributions. As is the case in general, public financial flows to energy in India are significant, complex, and evolving in its form, underscoring the importance of public actors, energy SOEs, PSUs, in steering the energy transition. For India, public finance for energy also has a distributional impact. It is central to India's development model, jobs, and industrial competitiveness beyond macroeconomic stability. This report both notes the very significant progress made by India in moving towards its stated national determined contributions, but also tries to plan for policy transition to have more substantive achievement of the larger objectives. This report contributes by bringing together budgetary transfers, SOE investments, and public finance into a single analytical framework, as I said, providing a clearer picture of how public resources shape India's energy system. Significantly, this approach is replicable and is relevant for other emerging and developing economies as well. So that's also another use the report can be put to by the readers. For Indian policymakers, improved visibility supports better targeting of scarce public resources, helps assess whether support aligns with energy security goals, fiscal sustainability, and long-term competitiveness, and creates space for gradual, informed reform, an aspect which the report very well discusses in the form of a roadmap as India takes further steps to achieve these comparatively rapid and efficient progress towards its climate-related objectives. And the roadmap significantly is both for the short term and the medium term. And the government, based on its own objectives and needs, could just play around with this and take the efforts forward. So in closing, I want to just say that in an era of overlapping climate, energy, and geopolitical challenges, the question is no longer whether governments support energy, but ability to determine in a transparent manner the efficiently targeted initiatives that are aligned with global commitments, that support the achievement of these global commitments, and continued rapid achievement by India of these global commitments. Transparency helps understand the impact of policy and makes policy action credible and collaborative. It empowers governments to act deliberately, fostering trust and enabling shared progress. It also provides a basis for a nation to share its understanding, as I said earlier, and the strategies with other nations to help them achieve their own climate-related objectives and jointly contribute to global climate objectives. I thank you again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh, for foregrounding the importance of public financial flows and especially why this research matters. You have given us a lot to think about, particularly as India looks ahead to its next phase of climate and energy commitments. And with that, to build on these reflections and bring in some evidence from the report that you mentioned, I now invite my colleague Swasti Raizada, who is also the Senior Policy Advisor at ISD, to share some of our key findings from this recent report. Swasti?
Thanks, Soumya. Just give me a minute. I'll share my screen. Soumya, could I check if everyone is able to see my screen?
Yes, it's visible.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Soumya. And on behalf of my ISD colleagues, I welcome you all to this webinar. I'm Swasti Raizada, and I work as a Senior Policy Advisor at ISD's Energy Program. I'd like to use the next 10 to 12 minutes to share with you all the findings of the new report that we have launched today. It's titled Mapping India's Energy Policy 2025. And in this study, we explore the fundamental question of how are public financial flows shaping India's energy transition through an evidence-based mapping exercise. Before we get into the findings, I'd like to take a quick minute to share our motivation and approach behind the study. This research has been conducted keeping in mind the spirit of transparency. While there are enough studies on India's physical progress on clean energy goals, data sets are often missing on how public financial flows are really changing with the energy transition. We believe that improving this transparency on public financial flows, or as this report terms as government support to energy, is critical to help India achieve its long-term net zero goal by 2070. And that's the fundamental motivation behind this piece of work. This also helps us understand the alignment between spending and goals, and focus on affordability, energy security, and long-term decarbonization objectives. Most importantly, it helps support better policy design rather than a single pathway. And that's, again, another intent of why study public support and couple that with energy revenues. As a part of the approach of the study, our research team assembles a consistent data set, which covers around a decade of data on public financial flows. And as some of my previous speakers sort of alluded, ISD's framework on government support for energy has been used for quantifying the government support as a part of this report, which includes subsidies, SOE investments, which are basically PSU investments here in India. And we also look at domestic public financial institutions, which are primarily the financial intermediaries for power sector and energy sector largely, to understand where some of the investments are again moving. With that, let me move on to the high-level finding of what government support for energy is or was in the fiscal year 2024. This is the year for which we had the most comprehensive data fully available. I'm aware that we are launching this report in 2025, but some of the data sets that we work with are still under development, and therefore, there's this little bit of lag in terms of the quantification exercise. So in terms of just high-level numbers, we find in this report that the total government support for energy is increasingly rising, and it stands at around 6.3 lakh crores, which is 6.3 trillion INR. And for non-Indian audiences, this roughly translates to around $75 billion USD. And it's, as I mentioned, it's growing each year. As a part of this exercise, one of the other things that we do is we try and look at the fossil to clean ratio, because that becomes an important metric to see progress over time. And one of the interesting things that we find in FY 2024 is that the fossil to clean ratio has actually lowered in India, which demonstrates significant progress, and it is now 5 times the size of clean energy. And SOEs and PFIs are also playing an increasingly central role in how public financial flows for energy are moving. As a part of this entire public financial flows of 6.3 trillion, we find the subsidies account for roughly 3.5 trillion, which is 43 billion, and SOE investments are roughly 2.7 trillion. We do not add the public financial institutions investment because that essentially leads to double counting, since they're financial intermediaries in a lot of other sort of mobilizing the investments in other actors. So just double clicking on the first piece on subsidies, we see that energy subsidies are rising. They account for nearly 3.5 trillion, as I said, which is roughly USD 43 billion, and they account for 2% of GDP. Compared to the previous year, they increased by 11%, which basically means that the government is actually ramping up clean energy subsidies. This is also something that we found. For most of you in the room, for most of you in the room, I'm seeing we can sort of allude that most of the audiences in this webinar would probably be familiar with the government's flagship schemes. We see that central government has a next phase of clean energy subsidy programs in place on rooftop solar, on EVs, energy storage, VGF, VGF for offshore wind and green hydrogen. And there are also then PLI schemes which are helping incubate clean energy manufacturing in the country. And these are sort of like the push that we see on the subsidy side for clean energy you can also see on the right-hand side of the graph, where we see that clean energy subsidies are growing, which is the purple stack in the right-hand side chart, although they still remain marginal in terms of the overall energy subsidy quantity. The biggest item that we find in the quantification exercise of subsidies is electricity subsidy, and that's probably of no surprise to people who track this sector. Electricity subsidies account for nearly 59% of total energy subsidies, and this is sitting on the books of state governments, not on the central government books, which is basically where a lot of the clean energy programs are sort of located. And that sort of serves a very important purpose of welfare in the country, where energy affordability is still a concern. And this sort of connects back to the point that Dr. Harsha was trying to sort of mention, that we are still sitting at a point where we need to understand what is the objective of a particular subsidy, rather than saying that all subsidies are bad, because in an emerging country like India, some of these subsidies do have an important role to play. The final finding, I think, on this slide, which is the interesting bit, is that in 2024, we also saw a decline in fossil fuel subsidies, although a decline in the subsidy was more cyclical than structural in nature, due to softening of primarily international LPG prices, which is one of the key aspects sitting under energy subsidy, which I'll get to in a minute on the next slide. So as I said, one of the major subsidy items that is sitting under the total energy subsidy basket of India are electricity subsidies, which are for end consumers, and they are on the state government books. What this analysis also alludes to is that, and this is something that ISG has been working on through other projects as well, and we've observed that while electricities themselves are fundamentally not bad, and they are addressing the bigger question of energy affordability in the country, one of the underlying sort of problems that it sort of creates is that there's very limited fiscal space available with state governments to ramp up clean energy programs or sort of create another level of stack in terms of promoting some of the central government clean energy programs. And that sort of creates the barrier in terms of scaling up of clean energy. And we're seeing this in programs, for example, in PM Kusum, in rooftop, where states are supplementing some of the efforts of the central government. Schemes are actually seeing takeoff. But then for places where state governments are sort of constricted in the fiscal space to supplement the program at the central government level, the scheme sort of struggles. So again, that's an interesting finding and takeaway for this particular report, that why this piece of electricity subsidies is important, and sort of it's not just important to target them, but also think about like scale ups from state governments in terms of what can be done more. On the right hand side, this is the second biggest piece that is sitting under energy subsidies as per our assessment, which is the LPG under recoveries. And as we all know, India does run a very massive LPG program, again, to maintain energy affordability. So we see that there is LPG subsidies are increasing and rising with higher adoption, because the number of beneficiaries under, for example, the Ujjwala scheme are increasing. And there is also a universal sort of floor and ceiling between which the government is sort of managing the price. And a lot of this sometimes translates to the books of OMCs in the form of under recoveries, which then need to be bailed out occasionally as a lumpy amount. We saw this happen in late 2022. We saw this happen again in 2024. So again, these are sort of like, bulky compensations that are provided to OMCs to help sort of like clean the books on LPG under recoveries. The second biggest takeaway that I think some of the assessment on public financial flows for us was that while we see that clean energy support in the form of subsidies has started to shift and they're scaling up, we find that the shift has been slightly slower on the capex of PSUs. And this is important because India is in one of those spaces where we are sort of ramping capital expenditure through the government. And because these are new investments that are being made, it is important to sort of recognize what is the kind of asset that these investments are sort of attracting. What are the investments that these assets are attracting? And we find that 83% of the new investments that CPSUs have made in 2024 were in fossil assets. So again, it shows a little bit of a lock-in problem. While there are early signs of diversification by PSUs, the scale still remains small. And when I say this, you can basically look at the purple line on the middle stack in under SOEs, where we see that new investments are increasingly continue to be made in fossil assets. And in FY 2024, this is largely influenced by one big HPCL refinery that's coming up in Barmer, because that's a very big project. On PFIs, again, I think for public financial institutions, while we do see a lot of the debt financing moving towards clean, one of the other problems that still remains, especially for power financiers, is that their loan book is exposed to distribution loans. So again, like there is limited exposure that they can take on again, clean energy, because of, again, that exposure to large scale of distribution loans in the country. And while this is all on the government support side, which is the first lever of some of the work that we do, we also wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the revenue side of things. Because while we do understand that support is important, it's also important to understand how some of the revenues from fossils and clean are sort of being used and also being mobilized. So what's the mobilization strategy of the government, and where is the use of proceeds sort of going from the revenue? Because again, energy is one of those sectors in India which is a high revenue earning sector for the government of India. Revenues account for almost 10 trillion, and they contribute to around 16% of all government revenue receipts, state and center combined. So therefore, there is again like a major role that energy sort of plays in terms of not just what happens to energy, but also the wider economy. So we find that 90% of energy revenue still comes from fossil fuels in India. And this is interestingly primarily coming from consumption taxes, not really production taxes. Which again shows that a large burden of these tax revenues are actually passed on to the end consumer. And therefore, there is another sort of lever that we have that can sort of like inform the next phase of reform. One of the, and I think this is an important point to sort of notice and observe, because we see that while revenue is high for some of the fossil commodities, it is still not sufficient to cover the full social cost of fossil fuel usage. And one of the things that we've been doing, interestingly, is try and quantify the social cost of fossil fuel usage. And in this year's report, one of the novel things that we've done is we've tried to sort of look at the subsidy, the taxation, and then the social cost of some of these energy sources. So what you see on the slide today is raising this fundamental question that do tax measures on fossil fuels adequately represent these energy externalities? And we are talking about air pollution rising in the country and the need to sort of think about point sources, importantly, to internalize some of these costs, if not all. And what we've tried to attempt in this report is still a starting point of some of that evidence that is needed to sort of frame the taxation levels for fossil fuel usage. And what we find is that if we look at coal, for example, as a fuel source, coal taxation still accounts for only 6% of the true cost of coal usage when externalities are accounted for. Whereas on the RE side, we see that tax level to be much higher on a 22% basis. So again, like this raises a question of while we understand that prices may or may not account for externalities to the full extent, can we use tax to sort of create that level playing field to the extent possible? And that's something that we've again attempted in this report. Which brings me to my final slide. This is a very dense slide. I don't want to talk about the whole of the slide, but I think one of the things that we've done in this report, and there's a lot more text and sort of writing in the report. It's a fairly long report, goes a lot more detail into each fuel type, coal, renewables. So I encourage everyone who's joined us today to go through this report in detail. But from this entire landscape mapping that we have done across fuel types, we wanted to highlight 3 high-level recommendations in terms of what are the policy windows for India emerging over the next more than a decade. India has officially submitted an intent to host COP33 in 2028, which is one of the first policy windows that we see, given that India is taking up more climate leadership stage at the global forums. So one of the things that we sort of think are urgent reforms that are needed in the next 3 years is we do need to sort of look at the rising electricity subsidies in the country, because that constrains, as I mentioned, the fiscal space available for state governments to scale up clean and improve implementation of some of those programs on ground. And therefore, that's the first recommendation coming out of this piece, that we need to think about better targeting of those electricity subsidies. The second urgent reform that we are sort of putting out in this report today is there are many clean energy programs that are coming to an end in March 2026, like PM Kusum, which have been critical again in shifting some of that solar irrigation demand to the daytime. And therefore, like, there's work that ISD is actually doing on PM Kusum, where we found that there is a need to extend, although redesign the program a little bit to improve implementation. And finally, we still see production subsidies for fossil fuels as a part of budgetary transfers. And that's something, even though they are small, we do feel that is something that can be reformed fairly easily, because again, like some of these projects probably don't need a VGF funding since they are already commercial and bankable projects. So again, I think that's the urgent reform that we have sort of proposed in the report. And this links to, wider reforms in the economy, which is, how do we think about embedding and internalizing, if not full part of the social cost of fossil fuel production and supply, so that they better speak to social cost. For example, India has relax the FGD mandates, which are again which sort of again creates that takes away, I think, the incentive to clean up, and I think that's something that again needs to be probably revived. Another thing that we found is that the recent GST, for example, removal of the GST compensation cess, sort of encourages the use of low-grade coal because of, again, the price differential. So again, like these are reforms that probably need to be brought back into the table in the medium term. And finally, there is a lot of work that India is already doing in terms of, a climate finance taxonomy, but we see very little dialogue on what this means for public finance. And therefore, like there's a need to sort of start thinking about a whole of government approach where we start using some of the indicators in the climate finance taxonomy and embedding them as a part of not just budget planning, but also use that to sort of incentivize better reporting of sustainability metrics for, say, PSUs and PFIs, so that leads to a whole of government approach, which we think requires a lot of like fundamental block building and therefore takes much longer, which is why we've sort of parked it for the future. But I mean, like a lot of work is still already happening. So therefore, it's something that we think will need to take time in terms of translating it to the states as well. So with that, let me pause. These are still very high-level findings from the report. The report is fairly dense. In case any of you are interested in knowing more about the report, have any clarifications or suggestions for us, please feel free to reach out to the research team. I've left the email IDs of most of the authors on this slides, so that, in case you're interested, we'll be happy to, receive your valuable feedback. With that, I'll pass it back to my colleague, Samya.
Thank you so much, Swasti. Thank you for that clear and really comprehensive overview of the report. With that, we can now move into the exciting bit, that is the panel discussion. So I'm pleased to hand this over to my colleague, Shruti, who will moderate the conversation and also bring in our distinguished panelists. Over to you, Shruti. Thank you.
Thanks, Soumya. Hi, everyone. I'm Shruti Sharma. I lead the work on affordable energy for ISD, and I also lead the India team. I have the privilege of moderating this panel with an excellent lineup of experts that bring a wealth of experience. It will help us unpack some of the findings from this report. The plan is that I'll introduce them all now and then ask each of them a question, and then we'll circle back to see if we can squeeze in another question. So that way we'll have 2 questions to each panelist. We'll do a hard stop of this panel discussion at around 4:15 to see if we have some questions in the Q&A box aimed at any panelists. So with that, let me introduce our panelists. We have Vibhuti. Vibhuti Garg is the Director for South Asia at the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, IEFA. Vibhuti brings in a wide range of focus areas from her 20 years of experience on sustainable development through influencing policy interventions on energy pricing, adoption of new technologies, subsidy reforms, enhancing clean energy access, and access to capital and private participation. We have Mr. Deepak Dasgupta. Mr. Dasgupta is a distinguished fellow at TERI and an economist specializing in climate change and climate finance. He was a member of the co-writing team for several IPCC reports, and he's also lead author of the UNEP Emissions Gap Report. He's held several positions in multilateral institutions and government, from where he brings in a wealth of experience on several emerging economies. He was also principal economic advisor to the Government of India, Ministry of Finance, where he led the climate finance unit and also led climate finance negotiations at several COPs. We have Ms. Neha Kumar. Neha leads the South Asia arm of Climate Bonds Initiative. She steers policy, strategy, and partnerships on climate risks and sustainable financial ecosystem in the region. Her efforts are targeted at building policy mechanisms, market infrastructure, and capacities needed to accelerating finance for a green, just, and resilient transition. She has over 22 years of experience, and her current area focuses on transition and resilience finance, the role of financial policy and regulation, and DFIs and MDPs. And finally, we have Mr. Raj Pratap Singh. Mr. Singh is a former civil servant with over 42 years of experience with roles across central state governments and international institutions like the World Bank. He has worked extensively on regulatory reform, governance, and India's energy transition. He served as a joint secretary and private secretary to the Prime Minister. He was the Agricultural Production Commissioner of UP and later chairman of the UP Electricity Regulatory Commission, where he led major reforms in transparency, consumer protection, and clean energy integration. So with that, maybe I'll start with Vibhuti and then come to the other panelists in that order of introduction. So Vibhuti, we heard Swasti share that from the latest financial data, it appears there's progress on clean energy subsidies in India. We saw a little uptick there. So I want to unpack that a little bit and ask you to comment that as we see this sort of uptick in clean energy subsidies, what are some of the next generation clean energy technologies where public financial support can be most effective?
Thanks, Shruti, and thanks to the ISD team. Firstly, congratulations on the launch of the new report, Mapping India's Energy Policy 2025. It is actually a very good reckoner and kind of builds transparency on how government support in the form of direct subsidies, SOE investments, or public sector investment is shaping energy choices in the country. Now coming to your question, on which are the new clean energy technologies which requires this kind of support. As it is quite evident, we have seen in India, rapid deployment of renewable energy, which actually has been enabled by the sharp decline in the cost of solar and wind power. But more importantly, this cost reduction is not kind of happened in isolation. As your report also very rightly suggests, various forms of subsidies and public investments have actually played a very catalytic role in kind of enabling large-scale deployment, as well as, kind of ensuring de-risking of off-taker risk, whether it was like coming up of SECI, which was addressing this gap, but also the investor confidence got built. And now, in terms of which are the next generation clean energy technologies, I would still say energy storage is kind of foundational to integrating high shares of variable renewable energy. We have seen the prices very recently in the tenders. The prices not like long ago were hovering around 10 rupees per kilowatt hour for energy storage, for 2 cycles of battery energy storage costs running. But now we have seen the prices going down to 2.1 rupees per kilowatt hour. But again, as we have more and more renewable energy integration issues coming up with more deployment, we might need not only just 1 or 2 cycles, but we might need more long duration storage, because pump storage is another technology which is required. But at the same time, it will take few years to build. So battery storage will play a critical role. So maybe more cycles needs to run, whether it's 4-hour storage or 6 hours storage. And that's where still the government support is required. Further, we need support in the form of within battery energy storage. So for example, shifting from lithium-ion batteries, we need maybe other technologies as well. And that again, given these are not well-established technologies, requires an early stage support, market signal for flexibility services, and then long-term revenue certainty to reach that scale. In addition, I would say green hydrogen represents another strategic pillar of India's clean energy future. And this technology is particularly important for not for power sector much, but for other hard to abate sectors like steel, cement, fertilizers, and even maybe long distance transport. So the support is needed just not, only for kind of bringing the cost down, but again, as I was kind of emphasizing, there's this whole ecosystem that needs to be built. So not just the renewable energy cost, but the electrolyzer manufacturing. So another area where government needs to kind of build in, and I think Swasti in her presentation very rightly highlighted. So it's not just the downstream, but we really need to kind of incentivize more domestic manufacturing of modules, cells, wafers. We have already done that. But again, India is also betting big now for some minerals that are available. So if there is a shift, say for example, again, another thing which got highlighted, that how do we kind of ensure, so far the support has been more, say for example, for fossil fuels, but also in the mining sector. But if there is a way the government can support more upstream domestic manufacturing, but mining of these critical minerals as well. So these are some of the technologies I think would require government continuous support. And not only, I would say it needs to take a different shape and form, maybe not only just through viability gap funding or through capital grants, but also kind of helping crowd in more private capital through blended finance mechanisms. And that can really facilitate in establishing a case for these technology deployment to be uptake at much large scale deployment. So yeah, these are some of the key technologies that I would say would require continuous support in the coming years. I'll stop here.
Thanks a lot, Vibhuti. That was a really rich answer. Mr. Dasgupta, I wonder if I can come to you next. I want to start by just asking you to share a little bit about your experience of closely working on like COP negotiations. If you sort of ask you to reflect on the latest round of NDC submissions by countries at COP30, what do you feel has been missing in terms of mitigation ambition? And also, as India finalizes its 2035 NDC, what do you think it should consider, given that it has already met some of its 2030 targets on non-fossil capacity?
Okay. Well, thanks. We're just all back from COP30, and we were looking at NDC was, it was what should I describe it? A half-hearted expectation about how the NDCs from various countries would come forward. And I don't think we were bowled over by the NDCs that eventually came and some that did not come. So in a sense, that was, we were working in the COP30 was in a difficult place to begin with on the NDC ambitions. And I think so the gap between the ambition and what we need in terms of getting to the 1.5C or less than 2C targets globally, that gap remains on this thing. So as we think about not so much the negotiations, but thinking about what's the game plan for all the countries of the world, looking forward to the transitions that are afoot. I think I was on the scientific panel to the COP30 president, and we were looking at this question, little forward-looking. We were thinking about what are the key issues that we need to now surface. And the way I think we framed ourselves was to say that we are now very seriously need to start at looking at overshoot. So we are not going to we're going to actually breach the 1.5C. What's the probability that we'll breach the 1.5C over the next 2 to 3 decades? So so the question therefore becomes, it's not this idea about that you get these NDCs coming at some intervals when the entire climate. I think we are focusing on trying to get the all member countries to think about what's the collective goal and how do you reach that collective goal. NDCs, as you know, are voluntary submissions by countries. So how do you motivate the voluntary submissions to reach a different level? And so we've been starting to, I think it is time that we brought to the attention of the member countries, of the countries that are actively participating, that we have a gap. And this gap is not leading to the kind of turnaround on the emissions that we need. One good story was, I think at COP30, people were surprised or pleasantly surprised in the sense that there's been a turning point in overall global emissions. And that's hugely important because the first thing you want to do in a curve is to turn the curve. And then the question is, how fast do you need to turn the curve? And obviously, we are not meeting that expectation. That's why we're going to have overshoot. So there are two aspects of this overshoot that we are, as scientists, thinking about how do you motivate countries to do more, two things that we are thinking about, and that work is going on. One is that you want to keep the overshoot as limited as possible. So you don't want a blowout overshoot. You want the overshoot to be fairly narrow, and the duration should be as little as possible. So 2050 as a target, keeping it is very critical. Second point is that, so what are the NDCs? Therefore, have to realign themselves to do that. So we need that ambition and execution both to go with hand in hand with that. We are also extremely worried about the reason that we don't want to blow out on the overshoot is that we then will not be able to get back on the path ever again. And that's a serious risk. And that's something that we are beginning to look at. What are the risks, nature of the risks that are coming. And so we're looking at a whole lot of turning points that are likely, everything from the for the state of the tropical forests, everything from what's going to happen. Some things are going to be possible to turn around, some things not. And then there's an issue about is it time to start to be looking at how do you get the carbon emissions capture or storage? I mean, these are all things. So we are forward looking, and we are not thinking about one COP is going to solve this problem. It's going to take us, we think we now need to again think about kind of calibrating the whole to get to where we want. So that's our expectations. So yes, we were not, I think no one was very happy with the NDC outcomes, but I think we were, the positive news was we are turning. The question now is to start refocusing the attention of the global community, all countries, that how are we going to reach and the overshoot and keep the overshoot limited, and therefore think about 2-3 COPs that where we need to get the realignment working through. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mr. Dasgupta. Neha, I'll come to you next. So I know you've been doing some foundational work on climate finance taxonomy. We know India released the draft climate finance taxonomy this year, huge milestone for like moving in the right direction on getting finance for our climate goals. But what role do you think the taxonomy can play in shaping public financial flows? Sorry, Neha, you're still muted.
Yeah, I have unmuted myself. So first of all, a huge congratulations on the report. I think it's a fundamental piece of work, and we wait for what you produce every time. And it comes at also a very important juncture in terms of the policy initiatives that are beginning to connect within the Indian context. So I think I will answer the question, but before that, I will just re-highlight what you spoke of. One was that 90% of our revenue receipts are locked in fossil fuels. Now that is already a huge challenge for public finance and our economic policy thinkers and makers, right? So, which means that the transition will have to be planned and calibrated very, very acutely and minutely, because it will shift fiscal balances. So that is fundamental to our the question that we are discussing today. Second is something that Swasti highlighted, that what happens to the spending of taxes that you collect as part of transition. And there, I think Mr. Raj Pratap Singh will also be able to highlight that while the government wants the fungibility of monies, and yet ring fencing some money for transition is important. And one of the things that happens in, say, labeled market, whether that is of loans or bonds, is that ring fencing of money. And sovereign green bond issuances have also, has also done that. The third part is that any kind of policy reforms will have to be sequenced very, very cleverly, both in terms of their impact and feasibility, as well as the dependencies within the ecosystem. So there is a political economy question as well. Now, when we are talking about this, there was the initial point that Mr. Harshvardhan Singh had made, which alluding to your report, which was about the information base. Now, taxonomy has to be looked at as an information base to identify where the monies should go and where the investment should flow. So it is really essentially a shopping list of the future. Indian taxonomy is also a taxonomy of transition. So it is not only saying solar or wind, it is also saying all the other activities, whether they are in industrial sectors like steel and cement or buildings, where currently there is no technological solution, then it has to follow a trajectory of transition. Now, that is where you come to a difference in terms of what is the global trajectory of transition and what is India's trajectory of transition. As Dr. Das Gupta said, that 2050 still remains that pillar. And in India, of course, our net zero transition is spec to 2070. Fine, it is spec to 2070 because of where we are in our stage of growth and development. But if we are not following that scientifically, then we have lost the game. So in that sense, taxonomy needs to be absolutely rooted in science-based trajectory. Then you decide what will be your peaking year. Then you decide your sector transition pathways. You basically then begin from long end to short end of the path, right? So 2030 becomes then equally important as 2070 is. And by the way, the middle point, which is 2050, which is scientifically, given to us as that tipping point. 2047 advanced economy status Viksit Bharat is 3 years in advance. Okay. And there is no way I can imagine it without it being green. Correct? So if we are not really looking at a transition, not only as an affordable transition paradigm, but as a competitiveness and opportunities transition paradigm, then taxonomy is the key. It is the way you will basically identify where you are laying bets on, what technologies, what Vibhuti said. Now, Vibhuti said that all of these technologies are important and priority technologies. Taxonomy will tell you what is the emissions reduction potential, what is the resilience increasing potential in a scientific manner. So a whole list of technologies will become then viable. And then I'm coming to the public finance flows just right on this. Look, I think right now the first stage is the development of taxonomy. Simultaneously, there has to be an implementation pathway. I would imagine that when the taxonomy becomes final, it is actually used to tag public finance. It is used to tag public budgets. It is used at the sub-sovereign level to create transition plans. It is used to implement incentive structures. It actually is the basis of then where your balances will tip. If you're tipping your balance towards greener growth, then taxonomy becomes your very, very fundamental basis of identifying those technologies, those practices, and hence incentives, and hence a subsidy rationalization, and hence all of those things that you're trying to do within your fiscal balance also become absolutely important, implementation pots, where the taxonomy will need to get locked in. So this is my first remark on how taxonomy should be used by public financial flows. So what is currently a subjective matter of what is climate, what is additional, what is all of that, will become absolutely non-ambiguous and aligned to what IPCC is saying, aligned to what our growth strategy should be. So I think it is a list of opportunities. It is a shopping list of opportunities. It is an investment proposition equally relevant to public finance and to drive in private sector finance because it is an investment opportunity proposition. I'll pause here.
Thanks a lot, Neha. That was super rich, and I'm so happy to see that how you've sort of blended in with everyone else's inputs as well. Mr. Singh, I'll come to you next. So we know electricity subsidies remains the largest among all energy subsidies, and they're likely to rise as electrification is increasing. So in your view, just what reforms in subsidy design and taxation are essential to sort of keep electricity affordable, but also ensuring the fiscal discipline for state governments?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this webinar. And I have been hearing all the previous speakers as well as the keynote address well, and it's really very, very interesting one. In my opinion, India is at a very critical point where we have the global ambition. However, we do not have the capacity of our peer countries. We may be the fourth largest economy, but our per capita income, everyone knows. And the government's capacity to serve its citizen comes out of that per capita income. We have a tax to GDP ratio, which is also not very significant. So if you take that into account, where do we stand. And in that, we have got competing demands which are coming up from various sectors. Is not the only energy. Energy is a prime mover for our growth and development. But if you see how much energy we are consuming, for example, electricity is less than 1 unit per person per day. It's roughly 1300 kilowatt hours. So that is the number we are consuming. And what is a developed economy? Developed economy, even if you take the lowest one, they consume not less than 6,000. So if we want to become a developed nation by say 2047, whatever the political ambition is, so our energy consumption, or rather electricity consumption, in the next 25 or maybe 22 years should rise by say 400%. Okay. Now, what has been our historical growth? Is about 6 to 7%. Unfortunately, this year growth is stagnant. Basically, we are not having any real growth in the electricity demand. So whatever we are talking about decarbonization, actually decarbonization is necessary, but we are giving an emphasis which is stunting our growth. If you see why I'm being so blunt in that, because the same resources, if we use we should have focused more on the efficiency part of it, whether going for technology, whether going in for whatever subsidies, etc. Because energy has got three vertices of a triangle. First is the energy efficiency, second is the economy, and third is the emission. So you cannot have the best of all. If you try to move in, if you want to reduce the emission, your cost will go up. And if your cost goes up, then it will not be affordable. And if it is not affordable, then there will be hardly any demand. Now, coming back to the subsidies, unfortunately, in electricity are rising because of the reasons that we had schemes like Saubhagya, where accessibility was given priority and more lifeline consumers have been added. This Saubhagya has basically added those consumers who didn't have the capacity or willingness to take electricity, and the government provided funding to bring in them the net. So now once they are in the grid, somebody has to pay for them. That is number one. Number two, if you compare the how much money an average Indian spends on disposable income on his energy needs is at least 3 times more than the developed economy. The Indians spend more than 10 to 12% of their income on the energy needs, be it transportation, light, fan, whatever called. And third is the renewable. Renewable itself are adding onto the cost. The renewables are cheaper generation at source. If you use it at site, they are the cheapest one. Solar may be the cheapest one if you use it on your rooftop level. But the policies which we are having, that we are generating in 3-4 states and then laying down the long transmission line and using it, they are making everything very expensive because of the lower utilization of transmission, grid balancing, storage requirement, congestion management, flexibility, reliability, and whatnot. So is almost the cost equal of electricity generation from renewable, which is required to make it reach the consumers. So these pressures are coming onto the power sector, which has to be funded through the subsidies. Because if we do not fund somehow in the subsidies, then the demand will not go, the income will not rise, and income has got bidirectional causality with your electricity consumption and vice versa. So that is the challenge which we are having. So what is problem? What the wrong thing about subsidies is badly designed as well as poorly implemented and serious leakage. These are the basic, and there are problems with our regulatory framework also, because we have been going on in the name of whatever reason, we have been following a system of normative tariff setting, where a norm is set that you try to bring down your expenditure, etc., within these frameworks. So, and the objective is to keep the prices in control so that it remains. So it is a bad design. What we should have a cost reflective design, and to improve the viability, we must give the subsidy through a proper transparent manner. So the DBT could be one of the options of providing that subsidy. Unfortunately, implementing DBT is very, very difficult because of the metering gaps. Agriculture sector is unmetered. The mapping of beneficiary vis-a-vis the target DBT consumers, etc. And DBT has to be provided upfront, whereas the government budget comes towards the fag end of the financial year. So these mismatches are there. And what the other improvement which is required maybe perhaps that instead of category and consumer based subsidy, we have a system of domestic consumers getting all the subsidy irrespective of the quantum of electricity which they are consuming. That should be changed to the lifeline thing. That means everyone who is consuming only up to a certain limit will be entitled for subsidy. And third thing is tariff slab should be removed. Currently, what is happening that it is you have a different tariff slab for different consumption level, which is distorting each and everything. So these reforms perhaps will help us in bringing the subsidy under control and making it more efficient. Transparency, of course, is necessary for that. But biggest benefit will come from controlling the input price. Actually, the input price of power is heavily distorted, and the government is the biggest beneficiary of that. Why I'm saying so? Because take, for example, Indian power sector, roughly 72% of power is generated through the coal. So we are not having any clean grid. Your EVs are equally polluting because they are charged from the coal generated grid. 72% and 70% is the cost of basically coal freight and other costs, roughly 70% of the tariff from the coal generated power plant. So roughly 50%, 70% into another 72%, 50% of money goes to the coal. And how this coal is priced? Unregulated. What is the major portion of that? That is railway freight. Railway freight, how it is determined? Unregulated. What it does? It cross subsidizes passenger fares. So basically, government at the input level is taking out so much money itself that the cost of generation is going up. Add to that the regulatory framework of having a nowhere in the world, I checked, even Pakistan is charging lesser return on equity, forget about being tax free, on the PSU generated power. But India is the only country where 15% return on equity tax free is allowed to the CPSUs and state public sector entity. So there is a perverse incentive, and this is how that money is taken out, and that is recycled by way of subsidy. So that chain needs to be broken so that the prices come down. If the prices come down, the cross subsidization will come down, and the government subsidy bill will also come down. And if we follow that mechanism, it will be really very good, but it will be a lot of disruption. It will be causing a lot of disruption because coal itself is a great source of revenue for every government department. And even it funds the local municipal bodies and villages through DMET royalties and NMET, etc., and number of sources are there. So I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Mr. Singh. You really got into the granular details of price inputs, tariff design, and transparency. I've done a horrid job of timekeeping. So what I'll do is I'll come back to each panelist with a request to sort of give us a rapid reply in like 2 minutes. So maybe Vibhuti, I'll come back to you. On the topic of SOEs or PSU capex. So we've seen like the PSU capex has been steadily increasing since COVID-19, and a large part of that is being made for new fossil assets. So Swati spoke about that big example of building out refining capacity in India. And now, given that like PSUs are such critical actors in the energy sector, how can like the Indian government or other emerging economies as well enable their PSUs to more actively participate in the energy transition?
Sure. I think Mr. Dasgupta highlighted how the needle is shifting. So definitely there is a transition happening at SOE level, but yes, clearly because of energy security reasons or pushing more manufacturing within the country, I think there is some level of investment, I would say large amount of investment still going to the fossil fuel sector. But clearly, at IFA, we have been coming up with this Power Pulse dashboard where we have been tracking how the shift is happening. And clearly, some of the PSUs are leading by good example in terms of NTPC coming up with 2030 target, 32 target of 60 gigawatt of renewable energy. Even from public sector investment, we have seen how IREDA, the amount allocated from the budget to IREDA has gone up substantially over the years. And as a result, they are disbursing a lot of investments to clean energy technology. So yes, but is it enough? Definitely not. So there needs to be more, needs to be done. So in terms of some of the ways that government can enable is kind of aligning SOE mandates with transition outcomes. I think Neha clearly highlighted that, and also kind of ring fencing and accelerating clean energy capex. So just reiterating what Neha said on these two aspects. SOEs kind of still operate under legacy performance matrix, focus on capacity addition and short-term supply adequacy, but explicitly kind of integrating clean capacity targets, emission intensity goals, and flexibility matrix into SOE mandates would shift that investments and improve, by ring fencing, it will help in improving capital allocation and also kind of attracting strategic investors. Thirdly, I would say using more and more public finance to de-risk new technologies. So institutions like IREDA will have to again be further empowered to kind of deploy concessional and blended finance for some of the clean new energy technologies, which I spoke about, whether it's battery energy storage, pump storage, green hydrogen, grid enhancing technology, and the demand side flexibility mechanisms that as well that needs to come in place. Another thing is to provide long-term revenue certainty for clean assets. So SOEs are more likely to pivot if there is clear offtake visibility. SECI and the likes of NTPC have kind of come up with more tenders for both storage as well as round the clock. But I think the state offtake at the state level has still been low. So we need more and more states to come up with these tenders rather than being driven by a central organizations like SECI, which is then again faced with this issue of unsigned PPAs lying with them because the states are still not agreeing to it. So I think we really need to resolve more and more states coming up with these tenders and take more offtake happening. And then, also if we really have to kind of ensure our reliance on, again, something which has already been spoken again and again, how the revenue reliance on these fossil fuels still remains an issue, but how do we kind of help in coal asset optimization and repurposing, ensuring that these repurposed mines can be used for deployment of either clean energy technologies or other economic diversification opportunities in the state and can further contribute to revenue. So there has to be opportunities created for revenue shifts so that the state doesn't lose and is still able to kind of fund its other social and environment goals. So revenue switch will have to ensure happen, and the states will have to come up with economic diversification opportunities. And then last and foremost, then ensuring that this transition really puts the people at its center. So using some of those funds for, for just transition purposes, for retirement, for skilling, reskilling. So I think that's where the role of SOEs will have to play a big role.
Thanks a lot, Vibhuti. Mr. Dasgupta, can I ask you again, like to possibly draw on your experience as the author of the IPCC sixth assessment report with the focus on mitigation? What is like one area of climate mitigation? And you spoke so much about like the disappointment from the NDCs at COP30 that what's that area in mitigation that remains overlooked and really but urgently requires stronger public financial support? Mr. Lalgupta, you're muted, sir.
I'm going to do a more rapid fire response to that same question, but I think you've got such an the topic that you've started with the subsidies, the size of subsidies, although, we'll all have differences about how you define a subsidy measurement, etc. But there's a lot of spending that's going on. That's the question. And I think the panel, just as they've each of them described, suggests where the opportunities are. What we think is right now happening, I don't want to dwell on what we were focusing on in the IPCC. I think what the IPCC was trying to do was to think about on the mitigation side, but also on the adaptation side. There was not a sense that we were stuck with mitigation only. I think the challenge is to have whole of community engaged in the transition that we're doing. Whole of community engaged, climate resilience, these questions are very abstract questions, but turning it into practical means that we have to go to the subnational level. Next 10 years, I think in India, we have to turn to the subnational questions. And all of these things that we were framing in national context now need to be converted into subnational context. And I can think of a rapid fire things that we were taxonomy that Neha's so pointed out so well. It's so crucial. But within the taxonomy, we have to also start to think about incentives and disincentives for doing the taxonomy right, which is I think we have to reframe this whole taxonomy because it doesn't actually excite the audience as much as we would like it to be, which is that governments are spending a line item in the budget on a regular basis on something connected with the energy transition or mitigation or adaptation. For financial world, that's an opportunity set because the financial world then says, "Oi, if you're spending 25% of your total budget on clean energy transition, this is something we can work with you as partners to finance to you so you can scale up your clean energy transition fivefold if you need to do it, because that's what they count. I mean, we are from the financial world, we look at the things. So use the taxonomy for the power it really has, and don't talk about taxonomy as a burden for states to do green budgeting. They have so many burdens at the state level that they don't need another burden to fall on them. Number two is Dr. R.P. Singh's conversation about he started on the energy sector and the subsidies or what to do with the electricity sector. It's a critical thing. We have to turn it also into a discussion about how do you use energy for the next set of dramatic changes, electrification of everything. That provides growth and that provides jobs. So we got to turn the conversation a little. Why should I, the political economy question, what reforms do I need to do on the energy pricing side, or that leads to more growth and jobs. And I think we're just scratching at the surface of the transition possibilities and the dynamics. We've been too boxed in about just the big picture about the clean energy transition. We haven't taken it down to the MSME level. We have not talked about what needs to happen in the agricultural transformation. And that's why I say subnational. That's number two. Number three, I think we need to think about adaptation equally with the mitigation story. Don't overfocus on because the risks when we do this overshoot, as I was describing, we are getting these cascading risks which are rising dramatically. So at any given point of time, if 10 years ago the range of negative shocks that were coming, whatever size of GDP, if you wish to take it, it's about quadrupled or quintupled in size. So people know that these risks are hitting. So that gives you an opportunity. Rates of return on adaptation, if you think about, if you invest right in the kinds of adaptation you need to do, it's about maybe 3 to 4 times has a bigger rate of return than even mitigation at the margin. So that tells you something is we're not focusing enough on that. So work together. It's not so much the ring fencing around mitigation and clean energy transition and getting green hydrogen. Put that aside for a moment and start to think about what impacts you're going to have with your policies and empower the state governments to do that, empower the local communities to drive the changes at the state level. And not least, I'm going to end with my quick shot on air pollution. I think this this problem is a wicked problem. We know how big a problem it is, and IITs around India have been thinking about it, but none of them are as yet able to drive solution package that would be acceptable. And so something is amiss. When you have a problem this big on the Indo-Gangetic plain specifically, and it's hurting us every day, and there's a community felt need, and yet the solution package is not coming, means that must be a problem that we should be able to solve. And asking the question about how do you solve it as fast as you can, given the peculiarities of that. So these are my 5 big takes.
Thank you so much.
It's not IPCC is actually
Yeah.
on all of these, they're worried about these transitions. So that is there.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dasgupta. I think you've also answered some aspects to a question which is in the chat box by Urmi, which is asking about just where India can focus on in the next NDC. So I've taken your point on like drawing more subnational plans and focusing on adaptation as some of the focus areas. Thanks a lot. Neha, I'll come to you. Can you, in a minute, and I apologize that I'm squeezing you for time, just circling back to climate finance taxonomy, can you like elaborate just what levers can drive like higher lending from public financial institutions to clean energy, and just what are some of the challenges while we're trying to do that?
Yeah, so I think, yes, you are squeezing me for time because I'm tempted to elaborate on some of the points earlier spoken, but let's just see very quickly what are the levers. I think the levers, of course, a couple of things which are already happening and which will probably propel financial flows. There are 3 or 4 things. One is calculation of climate risks into portfolios, right? That is becoming important. RBI really have to thank the RBI to start moving the needle in it. What it has recently done is, Shruti, it has said that all the regulated entities, which will also include public financial institutions, some of them, of course, the scheduled commercial banks and AIFIs, etc., they have to start using climate change as part of the due diligence of their counterparties and adjust risk weights. Now, when you are adjusting risk weights, then you basically, it becomes so central to how you basically lend, right? So then your lending is not only it is also preventive lending, so that your risks to your portfolio are reduced. So that is what will lead to more adaptation finance, for example, should lead to, if you're doing it right and if you're doing it early, should lead to more mitigation measures. So this will become pretty central, if this comes around. Then, of course, you have to have better disclosures, as Swasti had already pointed out, better green asset ratios. All of this has to become part of the information symmetry and information architecture, so that investors know what you're doing. See, investors will, or lenders, they basically like more of that information coming from their counterparties also. So that's the other point. Data availability, robust data availability on these things from the counterparties is also important. So what I'm basically saying is, at an institution level, you can do as much, but there has to be an inter-regulatory kind of coordination. One institution or one regulator does something, the other one says that, okay, no information actually, or information, more information about climate risk is actually a disadvantage to my company. Then that doesn't work. The lender can only do as much or as good as the data that it is getting from the counterparty. The other things is just a little one. In a recent report that we had, come out with in September last year. So what the collateral framework of the central bank of RBI, okay? So we can make adjustments to that also. So what we do right now is that the banks, they basically pledge government securities as collateral to secure RBI liquidity, okay? Now, if you are saying that there will be a reduction in haircuts to those sovereign green bonds in which banks are investing sovereign green bond, then the value of the bonds will rise, and the borrowing cost will start coming down. So all of these are interconnected levers, so there is no one silver bullet. And I think risk weights, low carbon sector investments, and basically most of these institutions, by the way, also have early net zero targets much ahead of 2070. So if they have to start even achieving those targets, they have to be much more proactive in their transition pathway. Taxonomies, etc., give that systematic pathway. I have to say, I'm very tempted. My final remark, not related to my answer, is to Mr. Dasgupta. Of course, I echo on subnational, but Mr. Dr. Dasgupta, the biggest source of air pollution in Delhi is the lack of political will. That is it. That is the bottom line. China did it. They had a regional plan. We can do it, and the solutions are also there. It is the political will that we need to set right. So I will just pause there, and I hope I have kept to my two or
Thank you
extended.
so much, Neha. I encourage Mr. Dasgupta and Neha to continue the conversation in the chat. We'd love to watch it. I apologize to the participants. We've gone over time, but we've just got one final question before we wrap up to Mr. Singh. Mr. Singh, I wanted to come back to a point that you raised around higher costs around RE integration. So I think beyond like just public finance, we know the grid is rapidly expanding. It needs to expand. But what are some of the two most important sort of governance reforms that we need in the electricity sector outside of fiscal measures that could really enable higher RE integration, but also like protect consumer affordability? Sorry, sir, could you unmute, please?
Oh, sorry. As I call it, electricity is truly electric in India. And when I say electric, I define it as economic, legal, environment, commercial, and technical and regulatory infrastructure for consumers. So if you miss one aspect, whatever you do will not be successful. Now, having said that, it's not only the governance reforms which are required, because governance reforms are basically although they are high yielding and they are controllable within the organization's reach, but there are external or regulatory reforms which are also required. From the governance reforms point of view, what is happening is that we are having a project-based approach. That means whether this generation project should be established here or there, or whether it should be RE or whatever it is, and then separately for the transmission and distribution. What we should have a whole system-centric approach. That means we design a whole system in one go, that is, this generation will have this transmission and will feed to this distribution or load center. What is currently happening is that we have delicensed the generation aspect and we have unbundled the transmission system, but we have kept the distribution as a natural monopoly. So there is total disconnect. Somebody is coming up and setting up his power plant anywhere and then started crying, there is no transmission, there is no transmission. So that needs to be reformed and changed. That is one thing. And there are other associated things, but for the paucity of time, I'll skip those small and petty things. Second is we are talking about, we have moved from a base load, peak load regime to a flexible demand and flexible sort of supply side issues. But if you see our procurement, the wholesale procurement is a hybrid, is mixed, whether we go in for regulated tariff or whether we go in for market-based approach through exchanges. But on the retail side, it is the administered part. So the true market signals are not getting reflected at the distribution side because of issues which are related to regulatory reforms. So what we should do, we should unbundle the distribution also and convert it into carrier and content business like any other network business. If you see any other network business, when I may say gas, there is a separate carrier service provider and there is content provider. The broadcasting, telecom is always split. It is only the distribution in the power. That is the reason why distribution sector is always in the loss, because there is no competition. There is natural monopoly which is being propagated, and all efficiencies and politics and everything is happening through that. So to take care of that, split it into carrier and content business. Let the competition take care of the supply, and the dynamic prices can only be introduced if you have a unbundled system. So dynamic prices, that means whatever is happening at the generation side, when the sun is shining, that power is cheaper, the cheaper power get transmitted to the distribution side, and that's all. And the market signal will get reflected, investments will come, things will improve. But for that, the state entities must give away their power, because that power is coming from the government's decision to have administered price both at the CPSU's level as well as from the DISCOMs level. So primarily these two are the major reforms which will bring in a lot of efficiency in the sector. And before I conclude, I'll just like to make two very brief comment. Green hydrogen is a waste of time for, it will put India's whole economic growth at least by 2 decades. Why I'm saying so? Is neither energy efficient nor it is economic. Energy efficiency means if you take 100 units, it requires green hydrogen means that means you need solar energy to generate hydrogen. Through electrolyzers, you will lose 30-35% of the energy. After whatever you get, you have to compress it, liquefy it, store it and transfer, you will lose another 30-35%. So the round, and if you convert back in storage, some wishful people are saying, then its round trip efficiency is less than 20%. A country where we are giving only 1 unit per day, you are wasting 80% of energy for that process to get a clean attribute. And that to the clean attribute cannot be run because it will be using 9 liters of water per kg. So for the sustainability purpose, that's the argument. And you will use solar only for 6 hours, rest all how you are going to do the greenwashing, everyone knows. So my request to every proponent of green hydrogen is to, we should have it, but it is not the time. Once we achieve the development ambition, go for it. Similarly, second thing is this narrative of smart metering. It is necessary, it's technically essential, but it is financially unviable. Why I am saying so? Because if you see the lifeline consumers, if you work out the whole economics, I have written 2-3 blogs on that, but this is the forum, I think somebody should take note of it. Lifeline consumers, 100 unit less than that, and 3 to 4 rupees their subsidized tariff. So 400 rupees is this monthly bill. And how much is the OPEX? Because DISCOM does not have the money to buy and install those meters. They buy it on a TOTEX basis from the AMIS, Advanced Meter Interface Service Providers, at a monthly billing rate. And that rate is roughly 115 rupees. So 115 rupees of 400 monthly bill comes more than around 28 to 29% of revenue collection goes for that servicing, that metering cost. Even the AT&C cost is less than that, number one. Government doesn't give any subsidy. This is a misnomer that government is giving subsidy. Central government charges 1800 by way of GST and gives 900 by way of subsidy. So that is being pushed like anything. For what reason, I don't know. It is essential, beneficial, but the objective should be smart grid. And it is being used for loss reduction. Loss reduction can be done by simple prepaid meter which costs 900 to 1000 rupees. And instead of that, we are spending 8000 rupees for the smart meter. These two things I just wanted to highlight everyone, and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. With great apologies, I hand it over to Chris to help us wrap up.
Thank you so much, Shruti, and thank you very much, everyone. I think it's been an incredibly stimulating discussion today. It's really challenging to provide closing remarks for such a wide-ranging and insightful set of comments. Maybe I'll just flag a few points that really jumped out to me from this discussion that I hope others will leave with as well. One point that I feel like we heard from quite a few speakers was just urgency. Dr. Singh opened by emphasizing what we do now matters. We heard the same thing from Neha. 2030 is as important as 2070. So, and also from Mr. Dasgupta, the world is off track to meet our climate targets. So what we do in the next year, in the next few years, it really, really matters. These questions about what are the priorities for public financial flows are important. I think secondly, about the wider context and the ways in which India is certainly not alone in facing these challenges. Dr. Singh emphasized that, we've got commitments on public financial flows in the Paris Agreement, but we see the global support for fossil fuels still being very, very high. So all countries are grappling with these same challenges, and this is an area where I think also India is well placed to really show leadership, particularly with the huge successes with stimulating clean energy. Third point for me is maybe just data, but data for action. So we heard a lot about absences. We've got absences of a clear shared view of public financial support and absence of detailed information, and we need transparency, but it's got to be not just data for the sake of data, but we have to analyze it and then we've got to use it. So that came through very clearly as well. We heard about some risks. So we heard about the challenges from Mr. Raj Pratap Singh about having global ambition, but not always global capacity. Mr. Dasgupta flagged the risks of focusing only on mitigation, losing sight of adaptation as well. I thought Vibhuti made really great points early on around, also kind of good design of subsidies. We need to see subsidies for clean energy in particular as a catalyst. These are tools to be used efficiently to kind of really bring in large volumes of private finance. And I think we heard the same remarks from Mr. Raj Pratap Singh about we really need good design in these support measures. Bad design is one of the causes of the problems that we're seeing today. Neha also flagged the huge challenges around fiscal balances and just really emphasized this matters, like we need to be very careful in terms of sequencing, strategy, and so on. So those are the risks, but it's almost the end of the year. And I just think it was a delight to hear so many opportunities. We talked about urgency, and I think this is a panel discussion that was really rich in very specific actions that can be taken to try to move things forward. I think we heard from a lot of panelists about kind of, not just thinking about decarbonization, but thinking about the much bigger picture. A lot of what we're talking about is really positioning India for growth, for competitiveness. It's about building jobs. It's very much about energy security. It's also about health. The conversations we've had about air pollution. Decarbonization is part of what motivates us in this space, but it isn't everything. Vibhuti gave us a great list of key technologies: storage, steel, cement, fertilizers, manufacturing. It sounds like the panel is going to have some side conversations about green hydrogen, so I won't mention that one unmitigatedly, but certainly there's a lot of options to discuss in terms of what's most strategic for India to support. And we also heard that one of the big opportunities is this support really can bring prices down. So Vibhuti shared these really striking numbers, right? Like from over 10 rupees to just a little over 2 per kilowatt hour for storage in recent years. So although there's an upfront cost in providing support, it's also an investment. So it's really positioning India to reap these kind of targets around growth and jobs and security and so on. Targeting of electricity subsidies came up as a big emphasis, and I think thank you very much, Mr. Singh, for your comments there. Aligning SOE mandates with clean energy outcomes emerged as well. And then, of course, just the hugely important work that Neha has been doing on kind of the green taxonomy and her really important remarks about we don't just need a taxonomy, but we need to make a taxonomy that works and that is kind of got a plan for implementation, a roadmap. And I think Mr. Dasgupta had excellent ideas as well about, it can't just be seen as a burden, but it's got to be seen as something that's exciting. So this is not a burden, it's actually an opportunity. Aligning with this is a way to attract finance and create resources. So we have a big old list of really exciting actions that could be taken. Maybe the last idea I would end on is something that came from Swasti's presentation, which was she kind of talked about this need for a whole of government approach. There's so many ideas here. There's so many actions that can be taken. And maybe kind of thinking about ways to create spaces like the one we've had today to talk about this, to share ideas and to kind of come together around actually, what's the shared vision and the shared approach for the way forward seems like a really valuable thing to be doing in 2026. So those are my closing words, my attempt to summarize an incredible discussion. I'd like to finish with a very warm thank you to all of our speakers. So to Dr. Harsha Singh for the very thoughtful keynote address, to all of our panelists, Vibhuti Garg, Deepak Dasgupta, Neha Kumar, Raj Pratap Singh. I'd also like to thank our participants for joining us today. We've run a little over. Those of you who are still with us, thank you so much for staying to the end. I, of course, must acknowledge and thank the IST research team, comms team, publishing team for all their work making this webinar happen. Our report was read by a very large number of peer reviewers who provided fantastic feedback to help us make it as strong as possible. So we'd like to thank them as well. In case anybody who's joined us today has got questions that you feel were not answered, please feel free to continue the conversation through social media or just write to us. You can always reach out to any of the authors of this report via email, and we'll be more than happy to connect and to chat. So that is it from me and from the team. Thank you all once again for joining us. We hope you found today's discussion valuable, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and rest of the year. Thank you.